Well, that was a very nice welcome. I don't know how many graduates of UNC there are in Arkansas, or how hard you were pressed to find one to introduce me. But your introduction began in a very nice way, and if you will give me his email address, I will email your father after this event and tell him that it all turned out all right after all. Okay? I'm just going to share some very informal thoughts, and then I'll be very happy to answer questions or listen to your thoughts, or we can just, obviously everyone in this room is interested in the question of public service and public life, and so we'll find a way to talk about that. I want to begin by saying my thanks to Jeff Fox, who is basically the host of my visit, my Duke visit to Arkansas, and I would like to tell you that the reason this became pressing, since this is my last year in office, is there are only 2 states in the continental United States I have never been to, and one of them is Arkansas. And so I've mentioned this. You and I have talked about my coming to Arkansas. I've been president 12 years, okay. So this seemed like it had probably better happen now or not at all. And I am very, very happy to come to find this beautiful city, and of course a historical city. And I'll just tell you, anyone my age knows some things about Little Rock. I was born in 1947. This means that it was the year I was coming into 5th grade that every school child in America, as they began that school year, spent every evening watching the spectacle of federal troops preside over the integration of the Central High School in this town. I just finished a new biography of Ulysses S. Grant, and if you read it, the part you'll find striking isn't the part about the Civil War. It's about the period in Reconstruction when there was no civil government in the South, but a rather military government, and so civil rights were patrolled by the military. From the end of that period until 1957, that's a period of, what would you say, almost 90, 95 years. That's a pretty long time, but so for me, that will always be part of the meaning of Little Rock. If I lived here, I might regret that everybody who came said that, nevertheless. But then there's another thing, which is I didn't know this in 5th grade, but early enough in my life, I knew that there was such a thing as a Fulbright scholar, and that this was one of the great glorious things a person could ever be. Only later did I learn, I knew that there was a Senator Fulbright. He was still in full form in my youth and early manhood, but only did I later learn that the Fulbright Scholars Program had been funded by the federal government in 1946, so that's to say almost exactly at the time of my birth, by a bipartisan vote that was unanimous. And you just have to say, doesn't it sort of humiliate us to hear that such things used to happen? That both parties could get together and figure, don't forget, the United States ended World War I and retreated into a period of profound isolationism, which helped, of course, to create the climate that made World War II come about. After the Second World War, that was never going to happen again. The United States was a global power. It assumed leadership. Both parties were international in their focus, and the Fulbright was the federal government's vote that it was going to be a national priority of a high order to train some foreigners to come learn about us and some Americans to go learn about people elsewhere. And I'd like to say that a city that witnessed the integration of the public schools and the birth of the Fulbright Scholar Program is a place that has a lot going for it. And now I think of the name of Bill Clinton. He's the one who made us all call him Bill. I'm sure there are probably some people in other countries who think he should be called William. And I just want to say, I got to say a few things about President Clinton, but the first I will say is, for someone like me, part of the historical meaning of President Clinton is he was the first president of my generation. As you know, he was born in August of 1946. This means he was born within 6 or 7 months of me. You may not know that George W. Bush was born 1 month before President Clinton, and you may especially not know that Donald Trump was born 2 months before President Clinton, but that in a space of only about a year, the 3 people I've just mentioned, and Hillary Clinton, and myself were all born. what an auspicious period of history you must be saying to yourself. But I say to myself, I've actually never seen it. I've never read anything reflecting on the fact that we have had a long succession of presidents who came from the same historical moment, who were born in the same year. That never happened in the 19th century or the earlier 20th century. And maybe it's just coincidence, but I think a person of historical mind could argue that there are certain historical circumstances that made that possible. All these people, myself included, were born in the baby boom. They were all born just in the period after World War II, where a country that had been in depression for 11 years and then wartime austerity for another 5 or 6 years entered the period of booming prosperity that lasted from the middle 1940s for 20 years virtually without interruption. And all that brought in terms of an expanding economy, expanding economic opportunity, the expansion of the public university system in America, which tripled or quadrupled the number of spaces for students during that time, huge change in people going to college, and don't forget some other things that happened. The period of post-war prosperity was the period that finally returned to make an issue of integration. The civil rights bills that have been passed and constitutional amendments that have been passed by Congress after the Civil War, as you know, were more or less formally abrogated for a long period. And then this country, at this time of renewed prosperity, came back to try to renew the idea that if rights belong to everybody, then maybe it is our business to open doors to everybody rather than open some doors to some people and some to others. And I find it interesting that the period of which this, we speak of we've learned from Tom Brokaw to call some people the greatest generation, but this is itself an interesting generation, this post-war generation that had economic prosperity and the opening of the door in civil rights, first along racial lines and then gender and other things, was also the moment of internationalism in America, the time when America could no longer think of itself as having a horizon that drew its boundaries at the edge of the nation, but inevitably everything that happened in this country was understood to reverberate around the world. Okay, I'm standing at the library, presidential libraries. I love them. You are so lucky to have one. Not everybody has one, Have you ever drawn a map? It's actually very interesting if you think where president libraries are located. After President Kennedy, they're almost all located in the South and the West, right? So there's 2 in California, Nixon and Reagan. There's 3 in Texas, 2 Bushes and one Johnson. There's 1 in Arkansas. There is to be 1 in Illinois eventually, but it makes you realize the sort of demographic shift of this part of the country by thinking of the locations of the library. I'll just tell 2 little stories about President Clinton. I don't pretend to know him well. The first is about his speaking ability. I presume you've all heard him speak. I have heard a lot of good speakers, but I've never heard a better speaker, and I never will. But the speech, I've heard him speak 4 or 5 times. I was at Yale my whole career, as I think you know. Yale was founded in 1701. This means that Yale observed its 300th birthday in the year 2001. And much time was spent planning and planning and planning. The actual day, I think, was October 5th, 2001. Was to be the celebration, but something happened during that planning time, namely 9/11. And I believe, someone here can check it for me, I believe that Bill Clinton's first public speech after 9/11 was his keynote address on the occasion of the Yale Tercentennial. And so you're watching a person not just give a speech, but you're watching a person step up to a moment of extraordinary stress and crisis and uncertainty and even hysteria, of course, in America. To see this person, on his way in, he insisted that the university do one thing before he speak, which is to invite every student from Arkansas present at the university to meet with the former president. So out he came with everybody from Arkansas. The rest of us were feeling pretty bad. But then he got up there and he just started talking, and as you know, if you've ever seen his notes, he has a few notes in front of him, but that's not a text. This is not a text. But what comes out is better better than any text anyone could have written. And he just gave this extraordinary idea. As we stand here, what is the future going to be like? And he painted alternative pictures of an extraordinarily dismal, depressing future for the world in which we would all return to the days of tyranny, short lives, ill health, and oppression, or another alternative version of the future, more hopeful, more full of promise. And then he said, there's two ways people can approach this. I'll never forget, because I'd never heard anyone put it quite this way. He said, there are some people who think they belong to a group that already knows the truth, already has the truth, and is determined to sort of inflict their sense of the truth on the rest of the world. He said, but people like Americans, they don't think that they have the truth. They think they're on a journey. They think that the truth is a journey, that you're always on your way from here to there towards some better understanding, and that if you think of truth as a journey rather than something owned in advance, then you're going to realize you need to have everybody along on that journey, because everybody is going to have some part of what can be contributed there. And you just thought of this at this moment, as I say, of such a sense of vulnerability, such a sense even of hysteria, to hear someone speak so lucidly in a way that framed the historical moment. It did not ignore it in any way, but it put it before you in terms of choices that were available to a society, choices of a future. That was a powerful thing. I sat next to President Clinton when John Hope Franklin, the great African-American historian, the author of the book From Slavery to Freedom, was at Duke. He had been a particular favorite of President Clinton, and when he died at age 95, there was a memorial service at Duke. And I sat next to President Clinton, and I actually spoke right after President Clinton. But what was interesting is you could see him sitting there. Everybody else had their notes, and they were riffling through their notes, except not President Clinton. About 15 minutes, there was a long program. About 50, it's the kind of, have you ever been to the kind of eulogy where you count the fraction of speakers who have now 3 out of 15, 4 out of 15? So we're pretty far into the program, and all of a sudden, President Clinton pulled out a book. It was John Hope Franklin's autobiography, opened it up, flipped through a few pages, underlined a few things, took out a piece of paper out of the back and wrote a few things and put them down, and then he was ready to give his talk. And he got up and he just gave this talk. Again, I will never forget it. He said of John Hope Franklin, he was a happy, angry man. And then he explained the meaning of this in such a way that it was not a contradiction or anything else. Just an incredible gift of finding the words that give an occasion a sense of reality and significance. President Clinton called my office at Duke one day. My secretary said, there's a call and I think you'll want to take it. It's from President Clinton. So I said, okay. And he said, it was in the month of March, and if you're in my line of work, you can guess what he was calling about. He said, I have a friend who has a daughter who wants to get into your university. And I had actually been told about this person, and so I'd done a little scouting, and I said, well, Mr. President, I don't want to give you any false hopes. I don't think this is going to happen. And he said, oh, I knew that, but I said I would call, so I thought I would. I thought this would then be the end of the story, but instead he said, I don't know I ever told you about the first time I came to Duke University, totally news to me, and he then explained, you remember his mother worked in a doctor's office, and when his stepfather became ill, the doctor, having trained at Duke, arranged for the stepfather to be seen at Duke Hospital. And so he told me the story of driving down as a student from Georgetown, driving down through the night and arriving at Duke at dawn on Easter morning and seeing the Duke Chapel. And did I have any idea what an amazing experience that was? My dear friends, I'm sitting in my office looking out the window at the very building he was describing, but somehow it did not seem as evocative in reality as it did in his amazing account of it. And if you have ever seen the movie Primary Colors, where John Travolta, playing President Clinton, sits at the donut store in New Hampshire with the person behind the counter and looks them in the eye and makes a personal contact with them, I felt I am having the experience that many a million person has had, and what an asset that was. Let me just mention one other thing that I think of when I try to understand Bill Clinton and his generation and the generational circumstances that could have led him to where he is. You know that President Clinton came to adulthood, or even early adulthood, at a time when there was a massive insurgence in the belief in public service. I'm talking about after the Kennedy election, the inauguration, where a young person, the first president of a new generation, stood there and said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." These were the words that were really etched into the minds of people for a significant time. And don't forget what happened just after that, the creation of the Peace Corps, the idea that there might be something that's like military service, except it isn't military, and it actually gets Americans out into the world, and it's a form of service. If you think of Vista and all the other programs that were created soon thereafter, this was a program where internationalism, the idea of expanding the sphere of civil rights, economic prosperity, and public service traveled together. You know that the history of public service has had its ups and downs in American life, and I will say that by the time President Clinton and I had graduated from college, we didn't go to the same college, but we were the same college year. Then you were in the depths of Vietnam, the disbelief in the government, the extraordinary cynicism toward the actual intentions, not to even say competences of the government. You then had Watergate, and just basically the idea that the realm of public service is why would you want to do that? Why would you want to soil yourself by going into a place like that? Then followed by the more recent chapter in our public history, where it's not so much that government is corrupt as the fact that people seem to go to Washington to do things, but as soon as you get there, you learn that's not what we do here. We don't do things, we don't solve problems here. We engage in partisan votes such that our proud accomplishment is that the other side wasn't able to do what it wanted, even if the cost is that nothing happens at all. This has been a challenging time for public service in this country. I think that this nation always has been and always will be very civic, and I think that we have always continued to see public service mentality at the grassroots level, in cities, as it clearly is very strong here, at the state level, now social entrepreneurs, people who don't want to work for government, that's a bureaucracy, but want to try to achieve the purposes of public service through entrepreneurial activity. It's an interesting time, but it's a time that makes me happy to learn that this library is connected to a program in public service. A presidential library would be good if it were just a big box full of relics and unread messages, but it's even better if it links the traces of attempts at public service in the past to the calling to public service in the present to prepare people to launch them for their careers of public service in the future. And that's what I take it we have here. I want to, now you might say, okay, now where is he going to go? And where I'm going to go is to tell you that Duke also has a public service program. Yours is called the Masters in Public Service, is that right? Is there another place in America that gives that exact degree? Perfect. You should patent it. Master's Public Service trademark. Don't let anyone use that word again. But I want to tell you a little something about how Duke came to have a public policy school, because lots of universities don't have anything like it. And it also follows along an interesting political history. You may know the name of Terry Sanford. He was elected governor of North Carolina as a Democrat in the year 1960, the year of JFK's election. And he became one of a succession of people who were known as the education governors, making primary school education, high school education, public university education priorities for the state, things to be proud of, things people could aspire to on behalf of their children and be happy to put up their tax dollars for whatever kind of citizen they were. This was a remarkable person. You may know the name Terry Sanford because it was repeatedly rumored that President Kennedy had decided to drop LBJ from the ticket as the vice president in 1964 and was going to replace him with Terry Sanford. How long have you been down here? Okay, thank you. I mean, I've been looking at this guy taught at Duke, so if I say anything that's like really wrong, I'm sure you'll start. making a display of yourself. So Terry Sanford. When Terry Sanford stepped down as governor, it was a very difficult time for universities, the late 60s, with the unrest of Vietnam and so on. And Duke went through a particularly hard version of that, I think, because it was a university that was leaving segregation behind, as well as entering all the new world of cultural disruption and cultural modernity. And so, in their wisdom, the trustees of Duke University got Governor Terry Sanford to become the president of Duke University in 1969. This isn't the first and last time that ever happened. Woodrow Wilson was the president of Princeton, you may remember, but he was actually a scholar, which Terry Sanford never pretended to be. Terry Sanford was a politician, a people's politician, people's education politician, as the president of a university. I sit at the desk of Terry Sanford, and let me tell you, almost every day it occurs to me, Terry Sanford ran for president of the United States in 1972 and again in 1976. He would have been a very reasonable person to have won the nomination, and if he had won it in 1972, he would have done way, way better than George McGovern did. And if he had won it in 1976, that, because you had Jimmy Carter, whose name no one had ever heard of, running against the very established Terry Sanford, he would have been a very compelling candidate then too. He ran for president of the United States while president of Duke. He didn't go on leave as president of Duke. He ran for president from my office. Who was minding the store, one might say? Well, the store took care of itself. Maybe stores ran differently in those days. When he left the Duke presidency, he actually ran for Senate, as you know, and served in the late 80s and early 90s there. When Terry Sanford came to Duke, he made one academic contribution to Duke. He said, there's something you don't teach here, but you should, and it's public policy. And here was his concept. His concept is when you approach universities, all the subjects are separated out from each other. So economics is over here, statistics is over here, political science is over here, philosophy is over here. So he said, but in the domain of public policy, the domain a governor would know about, but an academic often wouldn't know about, those things aren't separate and they can't be separate. That if you haven't solved the economic dimension of a problem, you have not solved a political problem. And if you haven't solved the ethical dimension of a problem, then you haven't solved an economic dimension. History, it was also his insistence that history be taught, because how can you approach the solution of any social issue without understanding the history of where it came from or the history of the organization of people who will be called on to implement the solution to it. And so Duke created an Institute of Public Policy. It was created in 1971, very, very soon after he arrived. It was so elaborately furnished that it had the use of 2 basement rooms in a building called Old Chem, if I'm right, on campus, and there were a couple of faculty members with it. But Duke is the kind of university that when a seed falls on the soil, it often grows and grows, like Jack and the Beanstalk. And between then and now, the Sanford Institute has become the Sanford School of Public Policy. It offers an undergraduate major, which is based in that combination of economics, political science, statistics, ethics, history, all brought to bear on actual civic problems of the moment, seen from a policy point of view. About 10% of our undergraduates major in public policy. This is not true of the Ivy League schools. It's a kind of a distinction that Terry Sanford brought to us. We also have a master's program. Ours is called the MPP, Master of Public Policy, but maybe we can change that name by the time I get home. We have a PhD program in it. And I just want to say what the Sanford School has meant to Duke. What it's meant is, we all know we live in a world where there are problems. And we all know that it's the nature of these problems that they are shared problems. They're shared among every citizen of this country, and they're shared among every citizen of the world. There used to be problems such that if you were rich enough, you could exempt themselves. I mean, did you ever see an industrial city of the 19th century? Life expectancy was 20 years shorter downtown because the air was so filthy, the water was so polluted, but rich people could live at a distance from that. But no one is so rich nowadays as to be able to live outside the crisis of healthcare in modern society, the crisis of information in modern society, the crisis of environment and climate in modern society. And so a place like the and Terry Sanford couldn't have had this in mind, but when he created this program, the public policy school has become the natural hub for thinking in terms of problems instead of disciplines, and pulling the disciplines together as needed to help solve or think about problems. So our most recent, the only person in history to have been both the head of the Federal Drug Administration and the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Studies, Mark Mcclelland, recently came to Duke to head a health policy center that's all half in Washington, half at Duke, trying to think through, he was one of the people working on healthcare before Obamacare was passed. Everyone knows there are things about it that you can't do without, and there's things about it that are never going to work the way they are. So you actually need people trying to understand this isn't a matter of politics, it's not a matter of opinion, it's a matter of policy, of trying to get the policy right so that the incentives produce the consequences you want in terms of better health at lower cost. We have at the moment a system with worse health for higher cost. You're not going to solve that without people trained in public policy and without their heart in public service. Duke has an environment school, one of the principal ones in the country. A very interesting thing now is, we used to look to the federal government to pass clean air bills and clean water bills. This has become much more difficult in the modern political circumstance where Congress will not agree on things, and so things are done by government regulation that probably weren't meant to be done by regulation, and so they become vulnerable to reversal. But very interesting is the states all through this time have understood, clean air actually is an issue for everybody. It's not an issue for Republicans. It's not an issue for Democrats. It's an issue for human beings. And so states have been much more in the forefront than the federal government in the last several years in thinking about how to have the kind of regulation that gives the best health for people without overly burdening the economy. This has become a natural, the Sanford School of Public Policy has become a natural anchor for all of our assets, thinking about all the different phases of environment policy. National security, again, none of us are immune from the extraordinarily unruly and threatening times that we live in, not just in this country, but everywhere around the world. It was a thrill for me when General Martin Dempsey, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who, you may not know, had an undergraduate degree from West Point, but a graduate degree in literature from Duke University. After he stepped down as head of the Joint Chiefs, he came to an appointment at Duke where he is teaching, among other things, in public policy, because national security policy would be another thing. You're not going to get it right if you only look at it through a historical lens or through or through an economic lens. You're going to need them all together. I got to go sit in on he co-taught a class. So someone's teaching a class on national security and privacy. This class I visited the class one day last year. It was the very week that the FBI issued Apple with the mandate that they had to de-encrypt the telephone. Do you remember this from last year? Okay, so who was right in that circumstance? Is it the case that the interests of the government can be resisted by a corporation? On the other hand, if the corporation can be made to comply, no one knows for what purposes the government, I lived in a time in the late 60s when the government systematically spied on citizens. So you really don't want to open your door to that. But to actually have a room full of smart students of various ages sitting there with Marty Dempsey, it wasn't like any of these problems were being put out to Marty Dempsey for the first time. If you have been the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, you have sat in the presence of every difficult issue. And if you don't think there are both security and ethical dimensions to this, he clearly did. So that's an education you could get there. I don't know, something I learned from our public policy school, one faculty member works on the subject of orphans. There aren't so many orphans in America, but you can remember a time when every American city had an orphanage. But around the world, the number of orphans goes into the many hundreds of millions. And this person has worked with funding from the UN, trying to understand what's the best regime for orphans. Everybody thought orphanages were Dickensian, so those were all shut. But of course, foster care has turned out to be a site of very frequent abuse of children, who are often live in a state of virtual enslavement in foster care in some countries around the world. But to think of somebody trying to figure out, okay, here's a problem. It's not a subject problem, it's a human problem and a cultural problem. And so how could you bring the resources of a university to bear on thinking what the choices are there and how they might best be met? I could rattle on, but I won't, about the kind of things that you can deal with in a public policy school. It seems to me, I'd have to say, I'm a professor of English. I have a very traditional education, and I am not the least bit embarrassed about it. But it has been an education for me as the president of Duke to realize people need the old kind of education, but they need a different kind of education too, one that's based on bringing bodies of knowledge together to equip people to work with others to find the solutions to problems that are only going to get worse unless we find some way to make them better. In the face of this, the main thing you need is people who have a taste for it, people who don't want to absent themselves from the challenges of our time, but who want to plunge in and take up the role and see what they can do about it. I had a meeting, one of the alums of Duke from our business school is Tim Cook, and I had a meeting with him by chance 2 days after the most recent election. And he was careful not to opine about who had won or who had lost. I think his views were well known. But he said, when I come to Apple every day, he said, I feel like I leave the world of the ordinary world is a world of cynicism and hopelessness, and everybody's mad because nobody wants to take responsibility for anything, but everybody wants everything to be done for them and nothing ever is. And so he said, when I come to work, I feel like I'm leaving the world of cynicism and entering the world of inventiveness and creativity. And I thought, that's the very opposite of the way people used to talk about work in the old days. When I leave work, I leave the place of drudgery and I go to the place of, privacy and pleasure. But that's a pretty interesting, I'd have to say that's stuck in my mind. We live in a world where there is too much cynicism, too much cheap entitlement to complain about things that actually require everybody to take responsibility for them. Public service is about taking responsibility and using one's powers to see what you can do to make the world better, starting on your block or in your borough or in your city or in your state or whatever level. I only want to say I do hope some people interested in public service are willing to run for public office sometimes, because there are things that can't be solved except at the level of high government elected officials, and if good people don't want to get into that kind of mess, then we're going to be in an even bigger mess. Okay, that wasn't a very good line to end on. Nevertheless, let me end there and take your questions.
If you have questions, and if you do, please raise your hand, and we'll get the microphone to you. I got a question I want to start with. You talked about the public service thing. Could you talk a little bit about your DukeEngage program?
I can. This was something that was created at Duke in the year 2007. We used to have some students who came to Duke on merit scholarships, and they would include summer funding to do something that had a civic dimension to it. So we'd have groups of students in New Orleans for the summer, actually the summer after Katrina and things of that sort. This was very educational, and it made clear students want the academic part of their education, but students know that the academic part is not the whole of education. It's not the whole of what they want or what they need. So this out in the world part had something to recommend it. In the year 2007, we got the ability to create a program where we challenge every Duke undergraduate and we say, we'll help you find partners, but we want you to go to a place outside the bubble of elite education, a place where everybody doesn't have all the things in common that very selective students have. We want you to go to a place where you're going to learn what life is like for men and women in the world who live with needs. And while you're there, we want you to see how you can use things you learned in a classroom setting to try to work on problems in a non-classroom setting, in a real-world setting. And so we have engineers, they've taken all these advanced courses in signals and sensors, and then you send them to a place, that Africa is full of hospitals. We all think they're ill-equipped, but it isn't true. They're clogged with equipment that has been sent in humanitarian gesture by Americans that breaks as soon as it gets there. And then you're even worse, because the machine doesn't work, but it takes up all the space in which you could run your clinic. It is really fun to go meet a couple of students who are living with a family that, of course, does not have electricity. They haven't read at night for the whole time they've been there. They're living with the family, and they come out in the morning, and they're trying to figure out, how can I use my engineering knowledge from Duke to figure out how to fix these machines and then write the manual or teach people how to fix it themselves the next time it breaks. I said to these kids, this was at a place in Tanzania, when you get this was a lamp, like a lamp that you do over a surgical procedure. When you get this lamp to work, you send me an email. And about three weeks later, bing, my phone lights up, and there it is, this picture of the light working, you know. So I would just have to say, we've now had over 4,000 students who have been at sites around the world, and certainly also in the United States, who I think it gives a very powerful sense. You're being educated not to be a successful individual, you're being educated to be a citizen who uses your intelligence to try to make the world better where you are. So I think it's quite compatible with the things we were talking about here.
And when you go back, you might remind those 4,000 that there's a master's program that they could get their degree in public service.
I absolutely will.
Absolutely wonderful feeder system for a group program.
I can see the opportunity.
I admire your program.
I wonder what they had in mind when they hired you to head this program.
I've been studying your program, so I do admire it.
Great.
Hillary, yes.
Somebody have a bottle of water?
Sorry. Hi, my name is Hillary. I work here at the Clinton School. Thank you so much for being here. My mom went to Duke, so I'm a big fan.
You know, it's okay to be here even if your mom didn't go.
Well, she did, so I'm a big fan. My question is actually about universities, private and public universities' role in public discourse and potentially protest at things specifically. I mean, North Carolina is a really great case.
Of course.
A lot of interesting social policies and laws are being passed there now, and some very conservative, specifically having to do with LGBT people, transgender people specifically, bathroom laws. And I'm curious how universities can play a role in things like that are going on the state level, what limitations they have and what freedoms they have to participate in that discussion.
You know, the greatest luxury we have as humans is the luxury of using our minds. And none of us is ever going to get anywhere just by using our own mind. We have to have our minds interengage with the minds of others. That's what education is. That's what a university is in its aspiration. Universities have been places where status quos that seemed either justified or inevitable, and then after some period of time you look back and think, how did anyone ever accept that? Right? I mean, this is the nature of all social change, and universities have always played a lead role, or at least a frontline role, in the kinds of protests and questioning that have led to pretty much every kind of social change. I by no means mean that universities have a monopoly on it, nor that they should have a monopoly on it. You get a variety of challenges that come with this, and one I'm very well familiar with is when people are filled with a sense of righteousness, they often become, or I might even say immediately become, quite intolerant of people who don't think the way they do, people who aren't as good as they are. And one of the forces you have to contend with in universities is you want them to be places of criticism, but that means they're also places on their way to a new birth of righteousness, which means they're also on their way to becoming new scenes of intolerance, new scenes of repression. We all know how easy it is about certain issues to think, if you think that, you're subhuman. Right? I mean, this is a pretty frequent way for Americans to think about social problems nowadays. That actually is not either politically constructive, nor is it compatible with the mission of a university. Universities have to protect the space for protest, the space for questioning, and they have to ask of people to be sufficiently respectful of one another, not only not to shut them down, but even to try to open your ear a little bit to the part of the truth that someone else holds. You mentioned specifically, or you alluded specifically, to the famous laws that were passed in North Carolina that have to do with the use of bathrooms by transgendered individuals, right? So there's a definition that assigns your gender to the birth gender on your birth certificate, and you can't use a bathroom. I'm only going to say this, and I'll just be very frank. This law is a solution to a true non-issue. In a state with problems of unequal education, unequal health, everything else that we share with every other state in America, and certainly every state in the South, the number number of cases that have involved transgendered individuals, men who are claiming they're women using women's rooms with all the outrage that would visit on womankind. I have never heard of a single reported case of the problem to which this law was a solution. And so I think it's pretty clear this is an example of wedge issues, right? Of taking something that you can get people riled up about. Half the ads, the political ads in North Carolina this fall were about bathroom bills, pro and con, in spite of the fact that the reality of bathroom contention is actually one of the less pressing issues in our state. I think that when people began to boycott North Carolina over this law, that the NBA pulled its All-Star game from the state, I think they thought that the law would change quickly, and it was certainly a major issue in our most recent gubernatorial race, the result of which is not completely set, but it looks as if the Democrat will have won, no doubt largely in opposition to the role the last governor played in connection with this bill. But I just have to say, as a student of American politics, you've seen it all before. But a country in which it's easier to whip people up about non-issues with big charges attached to them is a country that faces every danger of not looking its real problems in the face.
Hey, Jim.
President Brodhead, thank you for coming. I met you at my daughter's graduation from Duke.
I was just admiring your shirt.
I wondered if you saw. Thank you. My question is regarding the dumbing down of America and the role of higher education. And I'm a retired professor of orthopedic surgery. I also trained at Duke. And I'm going to Tanzania to help teach surgeons there in February.
Really? At Moshi or at?
In Dar es Salaam.
Okay, fantastic.
And in today's paper, there was an article about performance of 8th grade students on international math science exams, ranking the United States around 10th place.
That's better than it's been in some years.
But it's still, the score's going down.
Right.
And it troubles me, I guess, so much how things have seemingly changed in our country, as evidenced by some of the scientific and other lack of scientific things during the recent election. So what is the role of higher education in trying to reverse the trend of dumbing down of America?
Well, okay, dumbing down, you don't want to exaggerate how recently dumbing down began in America. Have you ever read the book? You may have read it. It's one of the oldest but most enduring books of American political history, the book by Richard Hofstadter called Any Intellectualism in American Life. You have always been able to find a lot of supporters in America if you run on the idea that an educated person will call stupid or even willfully stupid. I mean, I wish this were not true, and I hope I'm not telling you something that surprises you. As for the international tests, those conceal something we all know is true, which is if you learn that the United States is now inferior to Malta and Estonia in achievements in reading and math, which I believe is true, what that conceals is what everyone knows, which is American schooling isn't mediocre. American schooling is, at its best, the best you're going to find in the world, and then some of it is mediocre, and some of it is not even mediocre, right? I mean, this is what we live with. There's these profound disparities in the quality of education and in preparation for education, which goes back to questions of early childhood and all of those things. That would be my idea of an issue that would be worth passing legislation about, or even possibly putting some funding to. Because there's two sides to it. One, intelligent people acting dumb to succeed in public. Right? I mean, it's a very challenging thing, but I mean, anyone who watched the last election, if you cite 3 facts in a row, you're regarded as really boring, or you know what I mean? You're not my type of person. And so it's very hard to run a government that's based on democracy when democracy is actually has as little faith in the idea of even factuality as we have found in recent times. I think this is the real challenge for us, and I think it's a new challenge. We heard people say, remember when you used to hear the line, you are entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. We've all heard this line. Now, that is, I think, we might be entering a period when that no longer is true, or that statement is regarded as true by some people but not by other people, right? Which would be to say, we're all entitled to our own theory of what the truth is. Right? This would be a very, very dangerous thing. In our public policy school, the very interesting part of it has to do with media studies, and actually you may know an internet outlet called PolitiFact that was used all through the campaign to identify white lies, Pinocchio lies, pants on fire lies. And as you know, the number of pants on fire lies was actually pretty high all the way through the campaign. I was talking to the leader of this thing, Bill Adair, recently, and he said, how are we going to get out and persuade the American people of the importance of facts? Well, you're not going to do it by telling them facts about facts. I think you're going to have to find some different way of appealing. I think one of the things you realize from the last electoral cycle, you've got to find ways to appeal to people who you want to think what you think. But you can't assume that they think what you think, or that maybe they just forgot it, and if you yell it at them, they'll remember it, right? These are very challenging issues.
Yes, so right back here.
Hi, my name is Xochitl Delgado Solorzano. I'm a second-year student here at the Clinton School.
Great.
And I have a question about the Professor Watch List website that was in the news a couple weeks ago, where students can go report professors who are anti-conservative or and what do you think the effects of such websites would have on institutions of?
The world of social media is a world that everyone loves. The inventors of it found something that somehow humanity had lived without for hundreds of thousands of years, but the day after it was invented, no one could live without it anymore, right? Everyone knows the abuses that social media, because the theory of like separate truth systems, social media really have advanced that profoundly in recent years. So everyone knows the problems that it's brought, but there's some human need or desire that social media satisfy that mean they're going to be with us, right? And the notion that you're going to have, I mean, you've seen all these questions recently. Should Facebook fact check things before it puts them up as stories? How could it? And how could you? I mean, that would be called censorship in some other places. But the uncensored world is the world in which every slander and every untruth is free to be told with a bright face on it. As for web, the notion that anyone's ever going to shut down a website because it speaks critically of you, I'm actually not so worried about professors and what's said about professors on websites. I remember when you first learned in the first days of social media, the incredibly nasty things that students say about one another on social media, stories people tell, private things that people tell and expose about one another. It's horrible. It's horrible. But I think that the only truly naive belief is to believe that we're going to solve this problem by backing our way to a world in which there are no social media. That's like those who thought we would solve the problem of nuclear weapons by returning to the moment when no one had thought how to invent one yet. The genie is out of the bottle.
Any other questions? Yes, Steve, right back here at the back.
I understand you are a globalist. Do you have any suggestions for specific things we might do or ways we might approach things to make globalism or globalization more palatable for some of the supporters of President-elect Trump?
Well, I'm not going to speak about anybody's supporters or unsupporters. The thing is, even the President-elect is known to have a business that is global. Right? So the idea that there is such a thing as the non-global America is a complete ahistorical fantasy. The trouble is you can play to people's fantasies, or you can try to help them pass their fantasies to the idea of the world. I'll tell you a thing that I worry about. We have a program in China that's ambitious, and we've certainly had many faculty who say, "Why would you go to a country where people aren't allowed to speak freely on every issue?" But every one of our faculty who's ever gone there has found they're able to teach exactly what they want, and that they've said that the debate in classes is actually livelier than in American classes, where everybody tends to think the same thing. Okay, so which is the place that has that has the free speech? I'd have to say, when I meet people who want to say to us, "Don't you realize that China is the new emerging hegemon? They are to the future what America was to the past, and so you can't interact with them. That's a losing battle on the way to their domination." You know, I already lived through one Cold War. I don't want to live through a second one. And I think that education is the critical factor. Catching people early enough in their life. You know, look at the Fulbright program. 250,000 people. Do you know how many heads of state and foreign governments had Fulbrights to America? Those people understood how to interact with America because of an educational program in later life that they had the benefit of in earlier life. I think everything we do to give people cross-border exchange early in life is good for the future of the world.
All right, I got one more question before we go. He loves presidential libraries, and I'm going to give him the Cook's tour here in a few minutes. But the other program that I'm really interested in that you've done at Duke is your program on entrepreneurism and impact investing, and that is very innovative, and it's quite extraordinary.
Well, you know, it wasn't so long ago that there used to be a few American universities that were very well known for entrepreneurship. One of them was located in Silicon Valley. And all the businesses there had been invented by the graduates of that university. When Duke first started talking about having an entrepreneurship program, what you discovered is that's what everybody wants to be in. Why didn't this exist before? You know, because the students we're seeing now, they don't want to go be a small piece of a big organization in later life. They want to help make the thing that they work in, create the enterprise that they're in. And I think that one of the really important things recently has been making us realize that for-profit entrepreneurship and not-for-profit entrepreneurship are actually continuous activities. They have many of the same challenges. They need many of the same kind of preparations in order to succeed. And so that's something that's been very, very big at Duke, is this idea of social entrepreneurship. We have in our School of Public Policy, we have a new program called the Innovator in Residence. The current Innovator in Residence is the mayor of New Orleans, who's there this week and who spoke this very week. New Orleans is a city, after Katrina, you know, you couldn't just sit around and wait for the city to regenerate. People had to go invent a new city, and so it became, in a way, ground zero for social entrepreneurship in American municipal life. And I think having people like that come and share their experience on your campus, the beauty of that is, you know, it may be that for startup tech companies, Silicon Valley still has a kind of monopolistic, you know, is what Wall Street was to the old economy. But social entrepreneurship finds its home in every town and every city where anybody can persuade a group of people that they've got a good idea and to help make it happen. I traveled down this morning with Jeff Fox and a guy who had a very famous career in the National Football League, who founded a program called PAC, which stands for Okay, well then everybody knows about it, so I don't need to tell you about it. But I'd have to say, what is that? You know what that is? That's social entrepreneurship. And he didn't have to go somewhere else to do it. He looked around and said, there's something that's needed here. And instead of just bitching and moaning at the absence of it, what if I pitch in and start it, and what if I get other people motivated behind it? You know, that's what makes successful cities, is having the culture of support of people with that kind of creativity. Okay?
Well, ladies and gentlemen, let's thank the president of Duke University.
Thanks so much. Very much appreciated.